Welcome, everybody. So today we have a awesome talk on APIs with Jennifer Shannon. I'm your host, Jason Gillam. I'm basically here just to be the person who asks all the dumb questions, and Jennifer's going to be the smart person in the room and answer them all for me. So this is D.A.R.E-inspired strategies for engaging developers, and it is an API-oriented talk. And you've given this one at a conference before, right?
Yeah, I cannot remember which one it is off the top of my head, but yeah, I've given this one before.
So it's a little different giving it over a webcast
Yes.
and being on stage where you can look out and see, okay, is everyone still paying attention to what I'm saying?
And this one, I think, is also going to be a little bit different in a good way in that we have Jason here for this one, and he has that development background that I do not have. So I think he'll be able to give some unique input or perspective on some of the parts.
That hopefully
Yeah.
I can help. We'll see. So, okay, so I guess on that note, we should start up some slides here and
Make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Here we go.
ta-da!
So
Awesome.
I hope everybody can see that just fine. But
yeah, I think so.
Yay. I do want to go ahead and give a little bit of a preamble before I start diving into who I am and all of that stuff. Well, actually, no, we'll get into it. We'll just get right into it. As soon as it lets me start clicking. There we go. If your mouse isn't exactly in the right place with PowerPoint, sometimes you can't move slides. So just quick background on me. My name is Jennifer Shannon. I'm one of the senior security consultants here at Secure Ideas. I am actually one of the few that's headquartered out of Jacksonville, Florida, but we are most of our workforce is remote. I just happen to be one of the few people that live like right up the road from the office. So I'm probably one of only a handful of people that really go into the office regularly. So my background, and I'll admit that in some ways I kind of got into pen testing a little bit different than some other people. Really, my degree was in networking and telecommunications.
At least that's adjacent to it.
Yeah.
It's something.
So I'd done like general IT for a long time, and I was like, well, I don't know a whole lot about networking. I know like the basics, but I want to know it better. And that's why I decided to get that degree, because that's my weakest area. Which I proceeded to not go into networking at all, really. Well, I was a SOC analyst, which actually that networking background or education really helped with it. But I ended up in a position where I was reverse engineering malware and doing threat intelligence.
That's really cool stuff.
And that is actually how I ended up pivoting over into pen testing. And so a lot of people I know in this field, they have other areas that they were really excelling at, like Jason, like I said earlier, had that development background. I know we have Eric, who had like that Active Directory background. I didn't come from a background where I was building things or creating things. I came from a background where I was deconstructing them and analyzing them to understand how they worked. And so I can't program to save my life. I'll be completely honest with that. I can do a little bit. It's not pretty. It is going to absolutely be duct taped together. And if anybody who had any idea what they were looking at saw it, they would roast me mercilessly.
You were one of those kids that probably took things apart, right?
Yes,
like,
I was.
Oh, let's see how this thing works.
That's actually how I learned to have that healthy fear of capacitors, because I got myself with one of them one time.
Whoops.
Yeah, it was a surprise. So some other fun facts about me. I'm all around geek. I collect things. I have a bunch of anime and video game memorabilia. I also run the Jacksonville chapter of Tool, which is a lockpick group. We meet on the second Friday of every month. So if anybody's in Jacksonville and they want to maybe learn how to lockpick, definitely feel free to send me an email and we can make sure that you make it to one of our meetings. And then finally, I have this fun, the little fact I have here about myself is my first real hack was a Tempest attack. And so this was, I think, the first thing that made me think, oh, I could be a pen test, or I could hack things. With a Tempest attack, you use a software-defined radio to detect and decode leaked EF or RF. Geez, yeah. I don't know how I got that, but you're detecting like these leaked signals from monitors so that you can view them remotely. So somebody gave me an SDR or a software defined radio, and I started playing around with it, and I started doing all these cool things. And that, I think, is really one of the things that like put me on this path.
That's really cool stuff. I will add also on there, which ties into your comment about anime. If you are ever at trivia night somewhere, make sure that Jennifer is on your team for if it's anime
Anime.
trivia. Yeah,
Yeah.
because otherwise you're probably gonna lose.
We had we went to a trivia night recently, and there was like a bonus round or a hot round, or I forgot what they call it, like a speed round, where they played a bunch of anime opening songs, and I was just immediately, I'm like, I know all of these. These are all on my work playlist.
Not just, it wasn't just it was, you had to know which anime the song belonged to,
and then the title of the song.
The title of the song, and you knew all of them. I think there were 5, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think most of the people here are pretty familiar with Secure Ideas, but if you're not for some reason, we are a small security consulting firm. That's how I describe us. I don't know how you would say it, Jason.
Yeah, I would say we're a little bit bigger than small now.
Yeah, we're medium.
Yeah, we're getting close to medium.
We've been expanding recently, so
yeah.
I have a lot of awesome new coworkers, and I've very much enjoyed meeting all the new people and working with everyone. So, but we do pen test, we do security architecture reviews, but something else that most of us are really passionate about is the training aspect. I spent a lot of time trial and erroring my way to success. Like failing my way to success is a real thing. Some of these things that I do didn't necessarily come naturally to me because, like I said, I don't have that development background. So, like the first time I ever encountered an API, I had no idea what I was doing with it. And it was a lot of sleepless nights teaching myself these things. And now that I've kind of gone through all of this and learned some of these things, I want to help share that information with other people. So hopefully you can have a little bit of an easier go with it than I did. And I have this, and I like to include this slide specifically, the what is professionally evil. The idea is that we think evil, so that way we can understand how an attacker might behave, what they will do, and that can kind of drive our pen test engagements. But I like to include that because this is especially important for developers. One of my favorite stories to tell, and I'm sure at least one person in here has heard this story before. So many years ago, it's insane to me now that I think about how long ago this was. This is like 15 years ago. I was a retail manager at Dollar General, and one of the things that I was responsible for was loss prevention. And for those of you who don't know, loss is the amount of revenue lost through merchandise either being stolen or damaged or accidentally stolen, because sometimes that happens. It's the amount of revenue of merchandise that is lost. And I had to go through like this, it was like a 2-week long training on like detecting shoplifters and like how to stop shoplifting and all that stuff. And one of the things they told me on the very first day was that to catch the bad guy, you have to think like a bad guy. And that was a really foreign concept to me at the time, because I never broke curfew. I didn't speed if I could avoid it. I still to this day have never stolen anything. Like if I've walked out of the store and realized I didn't pay for something, I've gone back inside to pay for it. So my whole life, I was just terrified of like getting arrested and going to jail. So it was really weird to me to try and think like like somebody who's trying to steal stuff from my store would, because I didn't understand it. And it took me, I want to say probably 2 or 3 months before I really kind of started to figure out how that works. And so it became this thought experiment. If I would be at work and I'd be restocking the shelves, and I'd be like, okay, if I was going to steal this, how would I steal it? Why would I steal it? Is there anything that could help me accomplish this? And eventually, one of the things that I figured out from this thought experiment was that the reason why razor blades were our most commonly stolen item in the store was because they were being used to open packages for other things. So then we locked up the razor blades. And so that is not something I ever would have been able to figure out if I had not tried to develop that adversarial mindset. And so today's talk really is kind of trying to engage developers to try and develop that adversarial mindset a little bit more. So hopefully they can figure out those types of issues in their own APIs. So I do have trivia, by the way. Woo! As it turns out, I like trivia. But do you or anybody, does anybody know roughly, this is a rough estimate because it changes a little bit month to month, I think, but about how much of current internet traffic is composed of API traffic?
That's a tough question.
So we got one right answer so far, and it's funny they're both on like polar opposites. It's about 82%.
Okay.
So
see, I would have thought streaming data would be, but maybe that's also considered an API.
Maybe, but I think also maybe the way that it's classified. But we'll talk a little bit more about why I think it makes up a surprising amount of traffic. I am going to give a very quick background on the D.A.R.E program for anybody here who maybe has never been in the D.A.R.E program. I'm from the 90s, so I was, and boy, was it ridiculous. As of this exact moment in time, I completely forgot exactly what the acronym stands for. It's like but it's an anti-drug. It's like,
let's see if anyone can guess.
Yeah.
I'm going to
Drug abuse resistance education. Yes, that's exactly what it was. Weirdly enough, they so I remember this, and that they would come to the school, they would have police officers, and they would come in and they would like tell you how to identify all these different like sketchy scenarios and how to get yourself out of them and say no to drugs, which in theory is good, but as it turns out, it was really ineffective. But I kind of wanted to use this one because I get a kick out of doing weird stuff, and this is indeed a weird thing. But another thing that I kind of really wanted to drive home with this is that D.A.R.E was focused on that long-term education and awareness, but also that personal accountability. And so I kind of used that framework, give or take a little bit, to try and encourage developers or people who have to maintain APIs in any way to develop more of a personal accountability and hopefully, continued improvement. I am going to give this is the simplest API request that I could possibly make. The way that I've always described APIs is like a waiter. At home, if I want to make spaghetti, I can make spaghetti. It's not a big deal. I have pots, I have pans, I have sauce, I have noodles. It's easy. I am not lacking anything I would need to make spaghetti. If I am, I can just go to the store and buy it. If I want a brick oven pizza, I don't have a brick oven. So I would either have to go build or buy my own brick oven, or I can go to a restaurant. Now, the restaurant's not going to just let me walk into their kitchen and start using it. They don't know me, they don't trust me. I could be doing anything to their ingredients. So instead, I'll go in, I'll sit at the table, I'll tell the waiter what I want, and he will take that order back to the kitchen. The kitchen will prepare it for me and then give it to the waiter, and he'll bring it back to me. And in the real world scenario of APIs, Facebook needs to give us a little bit of access to some of their internal resources for some reason or another, but they don't want to give us direct access to their internal infrastructure. So they'll set up these APIs to act as that go-between to facilitate access to the areas where they determine that we will need access to. One thing that's really important to keep in mind about APIs is that they're really kind of designed to be a computer to computer communication. This isn't necessarily something that we as humans see when we're on Facebook. We're not going to see that background API information, but there's a lot of ways that developers or people who are building their own websites might need to interact with the APIs. You would have a little bit more visibility, but your average user isn't going to see an API. They're not going to know an API is what's driving this interaction with the website.
Yeah.
So you are saying Olive Garden is my API for spaghetti? Yes, actually. Fun fact, this is something I have always said in every relationship I've ever been in, is that if you want to break up with me, take me to an Olive Garden. I will know. Just because it's like a really public place, right? Like that's the breakup place. So in this case, the user's on their they're using their web browser, and let's say we're going to Facebook. The application itself is going to perform this backend request to the API. It's going to then go, let's say, get my user information for some reason or another, and then it's going to return it back to me, and then I'll be able to see it in the browser myself. And there's a lot of different reasons why we have kind of started rapidly I say expanding. I don't know how else to describe this. Many years ago when I first started pen testing, I think I encountered maybe 1 to 2 APIs a year, and now it's at least 1 a month, right? And that's not counting the API tests that my coworkers end up on.
Yeah, I mean, there's many reasons for that, but just the overall architecture direction has changed a lot.
Yeah.
Back in the day that you're talking about, there was primarily what they referred to as a 3-tier architecture.
Yep.
Which would be a web server, web application, and database.
Yes. Those were the days. Not really.
That was pretty much it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
these APIs have really kind of well, they've exploded.
It's changed with a lot with cloud computing, right? Because the API, you don't, as a user, a consumer of the API, you don't have no idea what's actually happening behind the scenes, but you could make one API call that goes off to a database and another one that's looking up a file on a file system, but it's all abstracted.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different reasons why we have I have the automate. It'll handle like those repetitive tasks, like having to create tickets in a CRM or create new users, or even just updating certain things over a set amount of time. APIs really help with that, the automation part of things. But I think part of the reason why APIs have become so important is the combine. The one that I see on almost every test is I have Google Maps APIs. And so if there's any type of like locator or find the nearest thing to you, it's almost always has that Google Maps API integration. And so it helps kind of extend functionalities of web applications without actually having to build it out yourself. And I think the same for like payment processes. I see a lot of payment being handled through APIs. So companies don't have to, they should still worry about it. But the idea is that, hey, we're not the ones developing and maintaining this payment processing system. You should probably, if you are using one of those still.
But because you're using an API for it, you have the ability to control the entire user experience.
Yes.
Right. So I think that's one of the main things is we don't want to, as a business owner, you don't really want your website to then forward people to a shop that's some other domain that doesn't really look like it came from you anymore. It just doesn't come across as professional. I mean, you do see that for maybe smaller companies or like individuals selling things, but you don't want that for like you could never see like Walmart doing that, for example, or a big store or a big retail vendor or anything like that.
And I think a lot of like modern browsers would probably, I want to say I was either looking at a Honda or an Acura website recently, and it had like referred me out to a different like local dealer website for them. And my browser freaked out because it's like, hey, you were just on honda.com and this is like D.A.R.E-inspired.honda.com. Like, this is really weird, even though it was actually the legitimate dealer's website. I had to go look, but I notice those things whenever I get kind of jumped around and moved around in the like just the application use experience. And so I have this one last thing before we really kind of start talking about thought experiments. This is the current version of the OWASP API Top 10. And I know a lot of us have heard about the OWASP Web App Top 10. They have one for APIs. I really like the one for APIs. I have some thoughts about the web app one, but the one for APIs, I do actually really like it overall. But something that you really might notice about this is that a lot of the issues are in some way related to authentication, authorization, or access. And I say access such as the unrestricted resource consumption, where people can just continuously request things over and over again and bog down your server and prevent legitimate users from using it.
Right.
Those are actually the biggest issues with APIs. So I always want to call attention to it. And I think I saw somewhere, and I cannot remember exactly what the the statistic was, and I think it was from Cloudflare. I was reading this report a couple of weeks back that something like 90% of companies struggle with handling authentication and authorization as far as APIs go.
With APIs, yeah.
Yeah.
That's, I don't know exactly how accurate that number is, but I'd say it is a high number, yeah. But based on our experience, right?
Yeah. And I would say that is very much probably dependent on like the utilization of theirs. I don't remember the exact parameters around it, but it was things specific to that organization. But I think very frequently the things that I run into are just not necessarily the authentication process itself, but the authorization where I can access way more than I need to be accessing.
Yeah. Yeah, the unrestricted resource consumption one, just circling back on that one, that actually stands out as something that you don't typically have on a user interface, right?
Yes.
Whereas most of the other ones you probably have in some form or another. And I think part of that is because we have a control that works on user interfaces, which is, things like CAPTCHAs, where the whole point of that is to test to make sure it's not an automated process. But APIs are actually designed to be used by automated processes.
Yes.
So how do you
and there's actually, so I actually have a scenario that I like to talk about on this slide, that as far as the unrestricted resource consumption. So when we get to like the worst case scenario, we'll definitely circle back to that, because there's some really interesting case studies for that specifically. So let's say you want to build an API or you want to integrate an API. Really, where do you start? And I have D as define the risks. And the reason being is I find very frequently that a lot of people, when you look at the software development lifecycle, I think it's you plan, and then you start development, then you test, and then you deploy, right?
Pretty much. I mean, everyone has their own, but it's some form of that. Yeah.
I think more organizations should, part of that planning stage should include what are the potential risks associated with this API implementation and ways that this could be misused. And I think that if we kind of had that from the ground up, that a lot of these issues with APIs, especially around authorization goes, I think a lot of them would kind of be caught before the end or before anything actually goes to production.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the operational, the availability and reliability of services. On any of these, by the way, and at any point, something I will always ask, what is the worst case scenario for your organization? During any kickoff call, before any engagement, I like to ask, what is your nightmare scenario? What is the thing that keeps you up at night? Because that really helps me kind of tune in to the things that I should be looking for as far as that organization goes. But something, whenever it comes to that unrestricted resource consumption, something that I've seen quite a bit is like a reservation system.
Yeah.
There's not anything that's going to prevent me as an attacker from, let's say I'm really mad at Olive Garden. I'm not really mad at Olive Garden, but we're going to use it. We can make reservations online, and they do it in 30-minute intervals. There's nothing stopping me from making the script that will go through and create reservations on every available time block for the next 30 days.
Yeah.
And that would actually significantly impact a lot of restaurants. I know my family owns a restaurant, and so if this had happened to us, this is 4 tables an hour that we wouldn't be able to seat, or that we would have to, they would have a delay before we could start putting people at them. And that also stops legitimate people that maybe want to plan their birthday party or something at a restaurant, or go to this restaurant for just any reason at all. They won't be able to make those reservations. And I know that especially for larger parties, I'm not going to a restaurant unless I can make a reservation. So if I can't do it on the day that I want to, I'm just going to go someplace else. So that is, again, like Jason was saying earlier, that a lot of APIs are kind of designed for that computer to computer, or that automated step. Very frequently, something that we'll see is the application itself, like the web app, what is presented before me on my screen when I go to the website, will in some way limit that traffic, or say, hey, this is, you got to do this or you got to do that. But very frequently you can directly interact with that API, and those controls for the web application are no longer in place, and I can just mass submit things that way as well. And so something that we need to kind of keep in mind is, what are the access points for the API? We also have the compliance, the legal and regulatory standards. This is, especially important for like the healthcare industry. I'm going to step back for just a second. The very bottom one, that unsafe consumptions of APIs, that is especially important for the healthcare industry. When I first read it, I was a little bit confused exactly about what that meant. Like, why would I be integrating APIs that I don't think are safe? Why would I let that be on my website? But really what they're talking about is, it's one of the examples that they give specifically is that if I am a doctor's office and I have to have this client management system or patient management system, I might integrate an API into that. But because I am this tiny little doctor's office in the middle of nowhere, I have barely an IT department. The reason why I've decided to go with this API provider to do these tasks for me is because, well, they obviously are going to be encrypting the client data and stripping it out and taking care of that for me. And I don't have to worry about that because I don't really know what I'm doing. When really what is happening is that API that I'm trying to integrate, they're saying, hey, you're the doctor's office. It's your responsibility to take care of the client or the patient data and making sure that it is protected. So we're not going to do that for you. So I think inherently developers, whenever they're building in these APIs or trying to find this API to integrate into their web applications, a lot of times it feels like it's more secure, like this company definitely knows what they're doing, and they're not going to do their due diligence to make sure that it is actually safe.
Yeah.
Somebody said if you're Ticketmaster, that is a feature. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. There's a real problem on Ticketmaster with like bots, like abusing it to buy all of the tickets for concerts like as soon as they go on sale, which is unfortunate because that should not be a feature. And then obviously we have reputational, because let's be honest, no risk to any organization. None of those lists are ever complete unless we talk about the potential reputational damage to you. Even though it's 2024, and let's be honest, breaches happen.
Do they really?
Yeah, I know, right? It's crazy. I have assessed the security landscape. What are the biggest risks? Again, I have listed here the authorization and authentication, but realistically speaking, this is going to be dependent on each. This is different for every organization. And I always hate saying that, like, oh, it depends on your organization. But realistically speaking, let's say Google Maps, that API doesn't necessarily need to have as strong of the authorization or authentication in place because it is just a public thing. You can go look up maps. When we are trying to decide what is actually the biggest risk for us, where we need to start focusing our efforts is we'll do that roadmap. When we define what the risks are, we can find, okay, well, if we're really worried about client data getting out, here are all the ways that can happen. And then we can take that list and kind of move off of that and find the areas of the API that would actually be the biggest concern. I also have assessed regularly. One, it's important to try and identify these vulnerabilities early, but two, kind of ensures compliance. There's many regulatory bodies out there that require regular pen test, and I have audit. I do know one statistic from Cloudflare, and this is one that I do actually think is correct. 1/3, or just over 30%, of organizations that they studied in the past year had more APIs available on the internet than they thought they did.
Oh, of course.
So that is actually something that is very common with APIs, where it's like the security through obscurity, but also these organizations just did not know that those APIs existed for some reason or another.
Yeah.
Like maybe they moved it from a SOAP API to a REST API and never completely retired that SOAP API. And so it's just chilling there still.
Yeah. And I would also say that because an API is, you mentioned it before, regular users don't typically interact with APIs.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about in a large organization, the people who are usually if they're well organized with respect to responsibilities and applications, then there'll be some sort of application inventory that's being tracked, and each application is going to have an owner. And
yeah,
when they do that, though, they don't necessarily take into account APIs. And so it's very easy for a team to say, okay, well, these apps or whatever functionality, they need access to this data. Well, let's just put an API in front of it. And so they just put an API in front of it, and nobody records that that's now an application. It's not part of the application inventory. Nobody actually owns it. It's just there.
That's actually something that I always kind of harp on is asset inventory. And I think this is probably a little bit more of an issue with REST APIs in general. Because GraphQL, their endpoints, it's the one endpoint that all of these requests are going through. But for REST APIs, they have so many different URLs. And if you have 127 distinct features on it, that's very easily 127 different URLs to interact with. And sometimes those are stood up for just a little bit of time, and then nobody remembers to turn them off. They're not documented anywhere, so nobody knows that they're there.
Yeah.
Probably a little bit of a less of an issue with SOAP, just because the way that SOAP is, it needs to be documented.
But nobody can read it if it isn't.
Yeah, if it's not documented, you don't know how to interact with it. So good luck. But I think that's pretty common with REST APIs in general, just by the very nature of how they're built. So absolutely, it is important to have a list of your API endpoints because it's really easy for me to say, okay, yeah, I'm really worried about patient data getting out. And if we have the patient /123 and then patient /324, I can say, okay, yeah, no, we need to make sure that we're locking down access to the user IDs specifically. But if I'm not aware that there's a /users that will just give me back everything anyways, I might not be locking that down. And so that is actually something that if I see user, I'm going to try going to /users or something else like that to see if I can just access more.
Yeah. Yeah, that's especially common actually in GraphQL APIs. You find it in REST APIs too. It's a common pattern. But in GraphQL, it's almost expected to be there.
Yeah, GraphQL is it's fun and it's really good whenever you set it up the right way, but it's got a very steep learning curve, I find, compared to REST. So I have resist temptations. Now, resist temptations, one of the things that best practices matter. They're called best practices for a reason. And it's really easy, again, for me, from a non-development background, to say you should be following industry best practices. But they're considered best practices for a reason. And I will probably keep repeating that until the cows come home. But I will say, again, this is dependent on organization, because some things that work for one organization will not work for another. And there's a lot of different reasons, but there is sort of a best effort.
I have opinions on this.
Yeah.
So as a developer, I have opinions on this. There is a strong urge as a developer to just as quickly as possible show that I have something working.
I get that. Yes.
Right. And so a lot of times that means you're going to shortcut things like getting your security set up. And it's like, oh, we can add that in later. Let's just get it working.
Yeah.
Right. And most of the time in Agile, MVP, right? Minimal viable product. And most of the time that's that seems acceptable to just go ahead and do that. But the problem is that it's often much harder to then add security back into even an API framework later on than it is to do it right at the beginning, even though it's still a pain at the beginning. Like it's adding the security checks, or at least a framework to be able to do those in the beginning and getting all your tokens right and all your claims or however it is you're doing it. It's hard to get all of that right if you haven't done it before, but you really need to do that first.
It is. And that's I think this is kind of really where that mental model that I talk about comes into play, because it's really easy for me to say, because I've been in that position. Well, I've not been a developer. I've been responsible for maintaining infrastructure and maintaining with several large servers that had probably like 100 VMs on them for malware analysis purposes. And I had to build them and get them ready to ship out. And there have been times it's like, well, this all got here late, and we'll finish adding in that security once it gets set up and built into that environment. It's really easy to kind of fall into that. This is the way that we've always done things.
Yeah.
Which is not a good way to look at things, because this is the way we've always done things has resulted in catastrophe both inside and outside of this organization.
Well, especially when the next question is, well, why do you do them this way? And the answer is, I don't know.
Yep.
Like,
yeah.
Okay.
But I also have resistant patients listed like this. One, it's really easy to kind of throw stuff out there, especially with APIs, because they very frequently can become those out of sight, out of mind kind of things of just not applying patches to them. But there's also some lazy practices that I think we have all come across at some point or another. I have seen in API documentation where they put the test username and credentials in the API documentation that they then share out to developers or people that are using that service. It is technically public and you can sign in to it.
Yeah.
I've seen these credentials hard-coded on like JavaScript for websites. It's like, oh, we're going to go interact with this patient API. This is the API key to interact with it for our service. That's it feels insulting to call that lazy, but it's lazy. You don't want they aren't, for some reason or another, either they don't know how to do it, or they just don't care to do it, or they don't think anybody's going to go reading through the JavaScript, which, spoiler alert, I will. They'll just put all of that information in there, nothing to protect it. And it is unfortunately more common than I think it should be.
Yeah.
So definitely try to resist cutting corners or taking the easy way out. And then we have educate and empower. Now, I think something that we list on Pentest, I don't want to say all the time, but sometimes at the end of an engagement, we will give what's known as a strategic guidance. And something that we very frequently, I think, recommend is developer training or security. Why can I not remember exactly what it is? It's like improve.
No, I think developer training and education is.
I think that's what it is.
The essence of it, yeah.
Yeah, and the idea there is that there's a lot of developers that maybe started developing and have not kept up with the rapidly changing threat landscape. And I think saying it that way makes it sound like that was AI. But exploits have changed significantly since even I have started pen testing back in, I want to say 2015 or 16. I don't remember exactly when. I think at that time, I still saw cross-site scripting very frequently, and I still saw SQL injections quite frequently as well. And we see cross-site scripting somewhat frequently, and SQL injection, I think, where it leads to something important now that's a big deal for us, because I think a lot of developers a lot of developers have gotten a lot better at the input sanitization and parameterization.
Yeah. It still happens, but it is rare.
Yeah. But there's other aspects that just haven't been kept up with as well. And one of those areas is APIs specifically.
APIs, yeah. No, that's a good point. Well, I think part of the issue here, and this is I think a failure overall in our industry, is that compliance requirements, they usually require hey, cover your OWASP top 10 or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And
but there's more to it than that.
And so it ends up being this sort of checkbox CBT that a lot of companies will do in order to get past that requirement. But that doesn't actually educate developers on thinking. And to what you said at the very beginning of this talk, thinking like an attacker or thinking like a hacker. Or thinking evil, I think is what you said.
Yeah.
Getting to that point where you can take on the attacker's mindset, That's critical, because that doesn't, it's not just that it just applies to the OS top 10. It applies to APIs and anything else the developer happens to be involved in making. If they can think about, okay, how's the thing I'm building going to be attacked? That
Yes.
they can plan for it.
Right? And that's really important, because the very first stage for any pen test for me, beyond like reconnaissance, like the moment that I really start interacting and go to the application or start using the API itself, my first goal is just to learn how this is meant to be used by a user and monitoring how the data flows through it and developing that understanding. And as I'm moving through it, I'm kind of asking myself, okay, I see that this is how the multi-factor authentication occurs. If I was a bad guy, what could I do with that? Or, oh, I see that it gives me back that this server is this very specific thing. And if I was a bad guy, how could I use that information? And I'm asking myself, what is the harm of this? And sometimes it turns out, okay, well, there's not really any harm here. But sometimes it's like, okay, well, that led me here, that led me there. And now I have full admin control.
Right.
I want to say, personal achievement of mine, from the time that I first went to a web app to the time that I had full administrative privileges on it, was 5 minutes. And that was 100% through an API.
Oh,
so
certainly.
I never even signed into the application before I had an admin account. So somebody, it's like, hey, we have this here. Can you come look at it with us? And I was like, yeah, let me jump into this test with you and I'll see what I can find. And I noticed, oh, there's this weird API key that is just hard coded. And then I can authenticate with this API key. Okay, well, I can look at the permissions for this API key for this anonymous user. And that kind of went from there. And then I was able to create an account because there was nothing stopping me from making an account.
Yeah.
I think it's really easy to kind of things like that. Like, oh, it's really easy to do that in the development stage because, oh, yeah, let's just put this here. We can take it out later. It's really easy for that to be forgotten.
Yeah.
I
mean, that's a fact. I'll tell you right
yeah.
now, I've written lots and lots of code, and most of my code still has to-do comment statements in there.
Yep.
For things that I'm like, oh yeah, I need to remove this, or I need to change this when I'm afterwards before production or whatever. And I try to go back and get to all of those things, but
I always like to read comments because you'd be surprised at like the information you can get out of them.
There's quite a bit in there. Yeah.
But I've seen some like, stop changing this. But really, I will always advocate for trying to help build developers up, because I have it listed here that that first line of security, because maybe not 100% true, but when you think about it, once you've identified potential security issues, the developers that are building this, they're going to be the ones responsible for ensuring that this is built securely.
Yeah.
But I also have listed here to share that responsibility. I think that whenever I go into and I start interacting with organizations, very frequently what I'll see is it's us versus them mentality. I usually end up dealing with the security team, and they sometimes facilitate meetings with their development teams or their product owners. But you can tell from those meetings that those internal teams, they don't necessarily get along. The security is always trying to, we found this issue with you. And the developers are always on the defense because that's the position that they're being put into.
Yeah.
And so it should not be us versus them. It shouldn't be trying to catch, developers lacking. It should be trying to help build each other up and working in conjunction with each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You don't want that sort of adversarial.
Mm-hmm. We've actually made that a finding before, I think.
Yes, I have seen that in some of our reports. Yeah. Where it's like, yeah, you guys need to figure out how to work together because when they don't, then it just ends up causing more issues. I mean, it's understandable that organizations get to that point because they have totally competing objectives initially. Anyway, the development team, they're just trying to get their software out the door by a deadline.
Yep.
And the security team is trying to make sure that no secure software makes it out the door.
Yes. And I think something we kind of see pretty frequently, at least maybe I have, is that the development process starts without security. Mm-hmm. Security is brought in later. Like they've already
brought in to test things after it's built. Yeah.
Um, because they're not included in that ground up, it is just, oh, here's this thing, you test it. They don't have that. They didn't work on it from the get-go. They didn't have any input into it, so they probably don't have that personal attachment to it that the developers do.
Mhm.
But I think also from my perspective, like I said, I don't have that development background. It's really easy for me specifically to forget the amount of work that is actually required to implement some of these features that I'm telling companies to implement.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's not as easy as, oh, just do this update, because if they do that update, it's going to break this thing, and they don't have a good replacement for that thing because no comparative product exists.
Yeah. Yeah. And to Ed's point,
Uh,
security is now considered a major delay in terms of meeting a business deadline. So,
yeah.
yeah.
But I think the most successful products that we see, one, I can always tell whenever I'm brought in to test something that has been designed with security from like the ground up, like the teams worked together to help build this. Because while, yeah, I still will have findings here and there, usually they're not at quite the same number.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of like those smaller, or the really, I say smaller, but the real big glaring red flags have been caught very early on in the process. And when you think about it, that kind of actually shortens the overall development life cycle. While yeah, that first sprint, it's out, it's in production. But now we have all of these issues that the developers now have to spend the next so many months fixing it, instead of just extending the original development cycle by a month, maybe, to add in those extra security checks at every stage.
Well, and I would take that a step further and say that it's not just a matter of, oh, they have defects they have to go back and fix. Often what that means is we have to go back and rewrite something. Like
Yes.
it's a complete rewrite, or in the worst case, a complete re-architecting it and then building it, chunks of it from scratch, because it was built completely incorrectly the first
Yeah.
time, and it just won't support the security features that you need. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of important to do that. So since we have a little bit of time, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Why don't we talk about strategies? And this is completely off script.
Yeah. No, I'm
um,
completely okay to go off script.
how about talk about some strategies for getting the um, security team and development teams actually working together better?
I want to make a joke about like team building exercises, which,
Yeah.
I mean, I've been on some team building exercises that are really fun, like escape rooms, but also like if I was at like this huge corporation, and I had to do an escape room with a whole bunch of people that I don't actually see daily, maybe that wouldn't be as fun. So maybe don't shove a bunch of random people in a room for an hour and hope that they can solve a puzzle.
Although I will say that if you have a couple of security people who are like red teamers and they're really good at
Mhm.
physical security, and you go in an escape room and they actually start picking locks,
Yeah.
everyone else is going to say, "Oh, they're pretty cool." But yeah, I
So
don't think that's a lot of what ifs.
yeah,
Um, no,
that's
that's
a
good.
good question, because I think in a lot of ways it comes down to a company culture issue,
Yeah,
in
and you can't
that,
change that overnight. That usually takes time, right?
yes, that is definitely, I think in some ways, not only improving security training for developers, but maybe providing at least a basic developer like foundation, like training for the security team, so that they can better understand that. Uh, because, like I said, I don't have the development background. I got really good at reading and deconstructing and reverse engineering, so I can look at code and see what's happening in it. I just couldn't write it myself from scratch. Um, at least having that basic understanding of it and understanding the amount of effort that goes into it, I think that could help.
Yeah,
Um, but also probably doing things to improve collaboration. And it might need to be for some organizations. Some could probably just jump right into this, but some organizations might need to slowly work up to it, where at the very beginning of a project lifecycle, security is consulted. Because I think everybody likes to feel good about. I think it makes people feel good about themselves when you're like, "Hey, can I get you to look at this and let me know if you see any issues?" Because it makes me feel like my opinion matters. And I'm not going to say everybody's like that, but I know that maybe that consulting each other or improving
I
that
think that's a big
communication,
part of it. Yeah,
yeah, would
I agree.
hopefully help. I am open
Security
to,
champion programs is another one
yeah,
that's out there that can help if you do it right. Kind of on a related note, I know you've taught classes of like basically hacking applications or hacking APIs
yeah,
on several occasions. And you don't really get this so much, unfortunately, when you're teaching remote, when
yeah,
you're doing it over the web. But if you're in a room with people, have you ever had that moment where when your students just you watch them have an
yes,
aha moment and they realize I've been doing this all wrong. I've been
yes,
thinking about this entirely wrong. Um,
yes,
so
absolutely. And I think that there's also been, I think, several moments where I'll say, oh, yeah, something that we see a lot with APIs is I'll make a request for my user account.
mhm.
And the web application, the browser will only show me the information for my account. But what's happening is the API is returning all of the user's information in the database, and the application in front of me is filtering that out.
It's
But if I
filtering it
intercept that,
locally. Yeah.
I can still see everybody's information. And I've had people be like, that's crazy. Like, who does that? And then like I have gotten like people messaging me later saying, hey, so it turns out we did that. Uh
Oh
I
yeah.
think learning those, like they'll go back and like they'll kind of like really, I think, when you're interacting with it and you're paying attention to how that traffic flows. And I'm asking myself, okay, what could go wrong here? And if it goes wrong, what is the impact? I think that kind of
Well,
helps.
I think that helps a lot. That's kind of how, because I was a developer and I transferred into doing application security. And part of what made me do that, part of what got me into it was I just got very excited about it because I realized that I had gained a new perspective by going through and learning how do you break an application? How does an attacker
Yeah.
look at it? And that made a big difference to my overall attitude towards it. And I've seen others the same thing happen, and then I'll talk to them again later on, and they're still on the app security bandwagon and getting
Hmm.
pretty excited about it. So I really I like to see those moments.
I do. I really like it whenever they, especially because I think I'm trying to think of any, because I think the biggest one is that once you really understand that flow of data and an API, it makes it so much easier
Yeah.
to test it. And there's so many points of interaction too whenever it comes to APIs. Um, so I don't. It's crazy because like even if I'm on just like a web application test, like I'm on a web app test right now, I have found 4 or 5 APIs to actively test against. This was not an API test, but I found stuff using
But
their
they're there
API.
anyway. Yeah.
So,
Like you said before,
yeah.
they show up. They're unexpected, but they're there. Before we get to the end of our time here, does anybody have any questions about it? I guess anything that we've been talking about today? I
Or
should
just life in general.
throw that, yeah, or just life in general.
I can't promise I'll have a good answer to the life in general. Because like I said, I think I failed my way to success.
I
I
think we
think
all feel that way sometimes.
I think that they shared the quote for me at the beginning of this, or on LinkedIn or something. It was like, "What is the best advice you ever got?" And uh, in Adventure Time, Jake the dog at one point says, "Sucking at something is the first step to being sort of good at something," and that has absolutely been something that has. I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. That this silly little line, this throwaway line from a cartoon from like 15 years ago. No, it was 13 years ago. Oh my gosh. It just had such a big impact on me because I think, like a lot of people, one of the things that I really struggled with was, especially when I first got into security and malware in general, um, if I wasn't immediately good at something, I felt like I was failing. And I that held me back at the beginning, especially from like trying to put myself out there and do public appearances or do any type of public speaking, because I'm like, well, no, somebody else is going to be better at this than me. And that's always going to be true. There's always going to be something better at what I do. Everybody you meet knows something you don't. I think we've all heard that. But the more experiences I have and the more effort I put in, the better I become. And so, yeah, we all have to start somewhere. And very frequently that somewhere is just sucking at whatever you're trying to do. And so
well,
I think
that's how it
a lot.
starts. Eventually you do it enough times, you get better
Yeah.
at it. So
You eventually get sort of good at it, and then you get really good
there
at
you
it.
go.
So when I first started testing APIs, I had no idea what I was doing. None. I would be like, I would go home and I would spend the rest of the night like reading about APIs and trying to figure out how they worked. And because I'd never seen one before at this point, and I was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I would spend the rest of the night reading books and trying to figure out how to do it. And eventually, I got good at it.
Yep.
Now I teach a class on it.
There you go. No, that's all great. Since we're near the top of the hour here, just a couple of things really quickly. First, if you are looking for CPEs from this, they will be sent out after the webcast. So you shouldn't need to ask for them, but if you don't see them after a bit, feel free to shoot us an email. And then also next couple of webcasts we have coming up on August 22nd, from code to cloud, strengthening infrastructure as code security with static analysis tooling. So that should be interesting, from John and Alex. I think I was on a, I have to look back now. I was on a webcast recently with John. I think it was last month. And Alex, in particular, he is what we think of as one of our infrastructure people. So he does lots of automation around infrastructure. It's kind of his jam. So that should be a really insightful talk. And then we also have on September 12th, Kubernetes pen testing. And that one gets into, I'm sure is going to get into some of the weeds, because Kubernetes is a complicated beast. But we have Corey, our resident Kubernetes hacking expert, among other things, who will be talking to that. So that should be another very insightful one. It's probably, I'm knowing him, is probably going to get somewhat technical. So if you know anybody who's trying to secure Kubernetes systems and they're a bit technical in nature, you should advise them to go to that session. It'll probably be very good. So that's it. That's all the time we have for today. So thank you everyone for joining,